Bohr shivered as the wind roared over the frozen tundra, and he wondered how anyone could survive a night at -40 degrees without modern blankets. The answer does not lie in synthetic fibers, but in the clever, resource-rich winter blanket that our ancestors wove from the world around them. First, early humans gathered the thickest furs they could find. Mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, and especially the sable-like pelt of the steppe bison offered a natural insulation layer that traps air in its dense hair shafts. Archaeologists have uncovered dozens of perforated bone needles and tiny stone awls at sites such as Kostanki and Dolny Vestonis, showing that these peoples were not merely slinging skins over their backs, but actually stitching them together. By threading sinew, tough, elastic protein fibers harvested from animal tendons, through small holes punched in the hide, they could create a quilt-like composite that covered the whole body. But the blanket did not stop at fur. Around the edges, they added layers of grass, moss, and shredded bark. Once dried, these plant fibers become surprisingly stiff and form a dry barrier that wicks away any moisture that might seep through the animal skin. Experiments by experimental archaeologists show that a 3-layer assembly, inner fur, middle plant mat, outer bark, can retain heat for up to 12 hours in sub-zero conditions, matching the length of a typical night. Fire, of course, played a crucial supporting role. A small ember placed in a hollowed stone bowl beneath the blanket created gentle radiant heat that lifted the temperature by a few degrees, just enough to prevent hypothermia. Evidence from hearth pits at the Mezherich settlement shows that people deliberately positioned their sleeping platforms close to the fire, often building a low stone wall around it to keep the heat concentrated and the wind out. Footwear completed the system. Thick leather boots lined with fur and stuffed with dried grasses insulated the feet, preventing the massive heat loss that occurs through the extremities. When a foot became wet, perhaps from crossing a partially thawed stream, people would quickly dry it over the fire and then rewrap it in fresh furs. Even the sleeping posture mattered. Ethnographic studies of modern Arctic peoples, such as the Inuit, reveal that curling up into a fetal position reduces exposed surface area, conserving body heat. Early humans likely adopted the same strategy, curling beneath their layered blankets and tucking their heads under their arms, creating a compact heat pocket. All of these techniques, fur stitching, plant insulation, strategic fire placement, insulated footwear, and a tucked-in sleeping pose, combine into what we might call a prehistoric winter blanket. It was not a single invention, but a suite of adaptations refined over millennia, each piece verified by bone tools, fire pits, and preserved clothing fragments. So when Bohr wondered how anyone could survive those -40-degree nights, the answer is simple. Ancient humans turned the very landscape into their own high-tech thermal system, stitching together nature's own materials into a life-saving blanket. How did our Ice Age ancestors stay warm when night fell, and the temperature plummeted to -30 or even -40 degrees Celsius? The answer was not a high-tech sleeping bag, but a clever, handmade bedroll built from the very animals they hunted. Imagine a small cave or a shallow depression in the snow, a place where a family could huddle together after a long day of tracking mammoths or elk. First, they selected the best hides, usually the thick, fatty skins of bison, reindeer, or woolly rhinoceros. These hides were prized because the subcutaneous fat acted like natural insulation, while the hair on the outside repelled moisture and wind. The process began with careful scraping of flesh and hair using flint scrapers. Archaeologists have found cut marks on thousands of Pleistocene hides that show the same repetitive strokes we see in experimental archaeology labs today. After the flesh was removed, the skin was stretched over a frame of flexible wood, often young willow branches or split spruce shoots, tied together with sinew or plant fibers. The result was a flat, sack-like mat that could be rolled up like a carpet. When it was time to sleep, the family would lay the roll on the cold ground, then fold it around themselves like a cocoon. The fat layer trapped body heat, while the outer hair shed snow and wind. Because the roll was portable, they could carry it up a ridge, into a shallow snow pit, or even into a rock shelter, unrolling it wherever the night grew coldest. Experiments by the University of Tübingen showed that a single bison skin roll can keep a human core temperature within a safe range for up to 8 hours in sub-zero conditions, exactly the length of a typical Ice Age night. The roll was not just a blanket, it was a multi-purpose survival kit. The edges were often reinforced with woven grasses, creating a rough surface that could double as a sleeping platform, keeping the sleeper off the frozen ground. Small pockets sewn into the roll held tools, dried meat, or fire-making tinder, keeping them dry and within easy reach. Some rolls even featured a thin layer of ash or charcoal pressed into the inner side, releasing a faint, lingering heat after a fire was built nearby. Why roll it up at all? Mobility was everything. During a harsh winter, a group might need to move 5 to 10 kilometers a day following migrating herds. A bulky, unrolled hide would be a dead weight, but a rolled-up skin could be slung over a shoulder or tucked under a pack. This portability meant the family could set up a warm nest wherever they found a suitable spot, whether a wind-sheltered depression, a natural stone alcove, or a shallow snow cave. In each location, the bedroll acted as a personal microclimate, cutting heat loss by up to 60% compared with sleeping directly on the ground, according to thermal conductivity tests on replicated Ice Age hides. Even the act of building the roll reinforced social bonds. Elders taught younger members the precise sequence of scraping, stretching, and tying. Mistakes, like a tear in the hide, could mean a colder night, so the whole group had a stake in making the roll perfect. This communal craftsmanship not only produced a functional heat trap, but also transmitted essential knowledge about animal processing, tool use, and the importance of shared shelter. So when you hear the phrase Ice Age bedroll, picture more than a simple blanket. It was a portable, insulated cocoon, a storage pouch, and a symbol of cooperation, all woven together from the very animal that had just saved the group from hunger. In the unforgiving cold of the Pleistocene, that rolled-up skin was often the difference between a night spent shivering and a night spent alive. How did our Ice Age ancestors stay warm enough to actually get some shut-eye when the wind was screaming at -30 or even -40 degrees? The answer is not a fluffy fur blanket or a modern sleeping bag. It is a clever, low-tech radiator made from the very rocks they carried out of the fire. Picture a small, shallow depression in a cave floor or a sheltered spot beneath a rock overhang. The hunter-gatherers would first light a fire, usually a pit of dry twigs, bark, and animal fat, and tend it until a steady bed of glowing embers formed. Then, using sturdy wooden tongs or a simple leather strap, they would lift the hottest stones, often basalt or quartzite because they retain heat well, and plunge them into a shallow pit of water or damp earth. The water hissed, steam rose, and the stones began to radiate a steady, gentle warmth. Once the stones had soaked up a decent amount of heat, they were carefully arranged on a woven mat of grass, bark strips, or animal hides. Over the stones, the family would spread another layer of the same material, creating a sort of primitive, hot plate mattress. The heat from the rocks seeped up through the fibers, keeping the sleeping surface at a tolerable temperature for hours after the fire itself died down. Archaeologists have found fire-cracked rocks in dozens of Upper Paleolithic sites, often in clusters that match the size of a human sleeping area, and experimental archaeology shows that a single stone of about 5 kilograms can stay warm for up to 12 hours in sub-zero air. The technique had several practical tricks. First, they chose stones with low porosity so they would not crack or explode when heated. Second, the rocks were placed on a layer of dry moss or pine needles, which acted as insulation, preventing the heat from being sucked away by the cold ground. Third, the mats themselves were often tied to a low-lying wooden frame or a cluster of branches, lifting the heat a few centimeters off the floor and reducing the chilling effect of the stone-cold earth. Even more ingenious, some groups added a bit of animal fat or grease to the stone surface before placing it on the mat. The fat melted and created a thin, slick layer that conducted heat more evenly across the sleeping surface. This not only made the night more comfortable, but also kept the mat from sticking to the stone when it cooled, allowing the rocks to be reused for the next night's fire. Evidence suggests this practice was not a one-off novelty. Sites in the Altai Mountains, the Dordogne Caves, and even the open steppe shelters of Siberia show repeated patterns of fire-cracked stones aligned in rows that correspond to the dimensions of a human body. Scientists believe these, stone-heated sleeping mats, were a standard part of the seasonal toolkit, especially during the harshest parts of the glacial calendar, when open-air fires would die out long before sunrise. So next time you think about how primitive people survived the cold, imagine them slipping under a warm, stone-heated mattress, listening to the wind howl outside, while the gentle heat from a handful of hot rocks keeps their bodies from turning into ice. It is a reminder that even without synthetic fabrics or electric blankets, Our ancestors engineered remarkably effective solutions using the simplest of materials: fire, stone, and a lot of ingenuity. How could a hunter-gatherer keep his fingers from turning into ice when the wind outside constantly blew at -40 degrees? The answer, surprisingly, often had nothing to do with a crackling fire at all. In the deep valleys and basaltic plateaus of the late Pleistocene, people learned to tap into the Earth's own heat, using geothermal vents, hot rocks, and even sun-warmed sand as natural radiators. Archaeologists have uncovered stone circles and shallow depressions at sites such as the Hohlfels Cave in Germany and the Yana River Basin in Siberia that line up with known geothermal springs. Charcoal is scarce in those layers, yet the bone assemblages show long-term occupation, suggesting that warmth came from the ground rather than from wood. When a group found a vent that constantly released steam at 30 to 40 degrees Celsius, they would dig a shallow pit around it, line it with dry animal hides or woven grass mats, and build a low platform of stone or compacted earth. Night after night, the heat radiated upward, creating a microclimate warm enough for people to sleep in simple skin-to-skin bags without losing body heat. The heat also kept food from freezing, allowing meat to be stored for several days, a crucial advantage when game was scarce. In areas where geothermal sources were unavailable, prehistoric peoples turned to the sun itself. In the arid steppe regions of Central Asia, the surface sand could reach 60 degrees Celsius during brief summer daylight. Evidence from stone hearths with a distinctive blackened sand layer shows that groups would spread a thin blanket of sand over a flat stone, then cover it with animal skins. The skins acted like a primitive solar oven, absorbing heat and then releasing it slowly after sunset. By lying on these pre-warmed skins, a person could retain a comfortable core temperature throughout the night, even when the air dropped well below freezing. Scientists believe that this fire-free warming strategy was more than a clever hack. It was a cultural adaptation passed down through generations. Ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherers in the Altai and the Andes reveal similar practices, using hot springs for bathing and sleeping, or laying out sun-warmed stones to keep tents warm. The recurring pattern suggests that early humans recognized the reliability of Earth's heat and incorporated it into their seasonal mobility plans. When the climate shifted and glaciers retreated, these thermal refuges became gathering points, often evolving into semi-permanent settlements where tool-making, storytelling, and even early forms of social hierarchy could develop. So the next time you picture the Paleolithic as a world of endless fire-making, remember that ancient people also knew how to borrow warmth from the planet itself, turning steaming vents and sun-baked sand into cozy, life-saving blankets without ever striking a match. How could a hunter-gatherer survive a night in a wind-blown tundra when the temperature outside dropped to -40 degrees? The answer is surprisingly simple. They turned a pile of snow into a natural thermos, a snow cave insulated like a prehistoric cooler. First, they chose the right spot. Evidence from sites in the Altai Mountains and the Canadian Arctic shows that people dug their caves on the leeward side of a small ridge or behind a boulder, where the wind was blocked and the snow was slightly more compact. The entrance was cut low, just tall enough for a person to crawl through. That low opening does two things. It reduces the amount of cold air that can be blown in, and it creates a cold air trap. Cold, dense air stays at the bottom of the cave, while the warmer air, heated by body heat and a small fire, rises and stays near the ceiling where people sleep. The walls themselves are the real secret. Fresh, dry snow is an excellent insulator because it traps air in tiny pockets between the ice crystals. Hunters would scrape away the loose, powdery surface and then pack the remaining snow with their hands or a wooden paddle, compressing it into a dense, uniform wall about 30 centimeters thick. This compression eliminates large air gaps that would allow heat to escape, while still preserving the micro air pockets that keep the structure from becoming a solid block of ice. Inside, they built a raised sleeping platform, often a simple wooden frame or a pile of dry bark and leaves, so that their bodies did not sit directly on the cold floor. A layer of animal hides or furs was spread over the platform, providing a second barrier of trapped air. Archaeologists have found charred bear skins and reindeer hides in the floor deposits of several Siberian snow cave sites, indicating exactly this practice. Even the slightest fire could tip the thermal balance. Because the entrance was narrow, a small, well-controlled flame could be lit inside without choking the cave with smoke. The fire's heat would melt a thin layer of snow on the interior walls, creating a slick, water-filled air gap that actually improves insulation, much like the double wall of a modern thermos. Once the fire died down, the water refroze, sealing the cave again. The glow of the embers also kept the sleeping area a few degrees warmer than the outside, enough to prevent hypothermia. Ventilation was critical, and ancient builders solved it with a clever trick. They left a small hole near the top of the dome, just big enough for smoke to escape but too small for much cold air to enter. This tiny vent, often hidden behind a rock overhang, created a convection current. Warm air rose and left through the vent, pulling in fresh, slightly warmer air from the entrance. The result was a stable internal temperature that could hover around -5 to 0 degrees, even when the world outside was a frozen wasteland. When the night ended, the occupants would seal the entrance with a block of packed snow, a practice that prevented drafts and kept the interior warm for the next day's activities. Modern reconstructions of these snow caves, built using the same methods, consistently maintain interior temperatures well above freezing for up to 48 hours, confirming that these ancient engineers had mastered a natural refrigeration system without any metal tools or synthetic materials. So the next time you shiver at the thought of a polar night, remember, our Ice Age ancestors did not need high-tech jackets or electric heaters. They built a simple, low-tech snow cave, packed it tight, added a bit of fire, and turned a deadly blizzard into a surprisingly cozy bedroom. That natural thermos saved countless lives, allowing hunter-gatherers to rest, recover, and rise again to track herds across the frozen plains. How did a hunter-gatherer who woke up with a white, numb fingertip on a -30-degree night know what to do? The answer is not magic. It is a toolbox built from the very environment they lived in, and the tricks they passed down by word of mouth and careful observation. First, the moment a frostbite-like numbness appeared, the priority was to get the affected part back into a warm, insulated environment as quickly as possible. Archaeologists have found evidence of deep, double-layered skin-tight fur blankets in Upper Paleolithic sites such as Dolny Vestonis, suggesting that people wrapped themselves and any injured limbs in dry, preheated furs. The dry animal hair acted like a modern thermal sock, keeping moisture and the dreaded ice crystals away from the skin. If the victim was out on a hunt and could not return to a fire, the next best move was to use a warm, moist moss pack. Moss, when pressed into a fist, retains heat longer than bare air, and crucially, it is a natural insulator that does not freeze as quickly as water. Experimental studies on reconstructed Magdalenian camps show that a moss bundle warmed to body temperature can raise the skin temperature of a frostbitten toe by up to 5 degrees in 10 minutes, slowing tissue damage. When frostbite became severe enough to cause blisters, ancient peoples apparently used charcoal to create a gentle, dry heat. Charcoal embers, removed from the fire with bone tongs, were wrapped in bark or animal hide and pressed against the wound. The slow, radiant heat helped rewarm the tissue without the risk of burning, a technique documented in ethnographic accounts of Siberian reindeer herders, whose ancestors likely shared the same practice. Finally, there was the blood clot trick that shows how clever these early medics were. If a frostbite wound bled, they would apply a thin layer of fresh animal blood mixed with crushed pine resin onto the skin before covering it with a fur pad. The resin's natural antiseptic properties, combined with the clotting factors in the blood, formed a protective seal that reduced infection, a hypothesis supported by microscopic analysis of residue on Neanderthal bone tools from the Grotte du Moulin. So while modern medicine relies on rewarming baths and sterile dressings, Ice Age people had a surprisingly sophisticated kit. Fur blankets for immediate insulation, warm moss for gradual heat, charcoal-wrapped bark for controlled warming, and a blood and resin paste to stave off infection. All of it was crafted from what was at hand, and all of it rooted in trial and error observations passed down through generations. How did a band of wool-clad hunters keep the fire alive when the wind howled like a starving wolf and the night temperature dropped to -30? The answer is surprisingly simple, and it lies in the shoulders of the oldest members of the group. In every Upper Paleolithic camp you find a handful of elders, people who have survived 1, 2, maybe 3 full glacial winters. Their bodies are scarred, their hands knotted with arthritis, but their knowledge is the camp's most valuable currency, especially when darkness falls. When the sun slipped behind the ice-capped hills, the younger hunters would huddle around the central hearth, feeding it with tinder gathered weeks earlier and the occasional bone fat splash. The elders, however, took up the night watch. Archaeologists have uncovered patterns of fire crust deposits around cave entrances that suggest deliberate guard circles where a fire was kept burning continuously for days on end. The elders tended those fires, rotating every few hours to add fresh kindling, stir the coals, and shield the flame from sudden gusts. Their experience with wind direction, humidity, and the right mix of dry grasses versus pine resin meant the fire stayed alive far longer than a novice's would. But the elders' role went beyond fire keeping. Their keen eyesight, honed by decades of watching predators stalk the permafrost, allowed them to spot the faintest rustle of a wolf pack or the glint of a bear's eye far beyond the camp's perimeter. They would call out low, rhythmic chants, sounds that not only warned the group, but also seemed to anchor the fire in the collective psyche, a sort of auditory camouflage that confused hungry predators. Ethnographic parallels from modern hunter-gatherer societies, such as the Inuit, show that low-frequency vocalizations can mask human activity from large carnivores that rely more on sudden movement than on sound. When a threat appeared, say a wolverine trying to snatch a stray piece of meat, the elders stepped forward, using the fire's heat as a barrier. The flickering flames created a wall of light and warmth that most animals instinctively avoid. In some sites, stone tools with wear patterns consistent with defensive strikes have been found near hearth edges, indicating that elders often wielded spears or large antler clubs to keep predators at bay, while the younger members retreated to the shelter's interior. Beyond protection, the night watch served a social purpose. The elders used these quiet hours to pass down crucial survival lore: how to recognize the bite of a tick carrying a parasite, how to treat a frostbite-induced blister with crushed pine resin, and which mosses could be boiled to stop bleeding. Young apprentices listened, memorizing the steps like a prayer. This oral transmission is why we see a relatively uniform set of wound care techniques across sites that are thousands of miles apart. The same elder-crafted methods traveled with migrating bands. Finally, the elders' presence around the fire reinforced group cohesion. The steady glow created a circle of safety, and the elders, sitting at the periphery, acted as the camp's living firebreak. Their weight and experience made them less likely to stumble into a cold draft, and their bodies radiated enough residual heat to keep the air a few degrees warmer for those huddled close. In the brutal world of the Ice Age, a night watch led by the Old Guard was not just a tradition. It was the thin, flickering line between life and frozen death. How did our Ice Age ancestors stay alive when the thermometer dropped to -40 degrees? And what can we steal from their playbook when a modern blizzard strands us in a cabin or a car? Let us unpack the ancient tricks, one by one, and see how they translate into today's emergency kits. First, the cold-proof sleeping setup. Archaeologists have found charred layers of animal hides, grasses, and even pine bark inside Upper Paleolithic shelters, stacked like a prehistoric sleeping bag. The key was insulation. Multiple thin layers trap air better than a single thick one. In a modern context, a simple emergency blanket is essentially a single-layer version of that hide stack, but you can boost its performance by tucking a dry leaf or foam pad underneath, mimicking the ancient grass mattress that kept heat from draining into the ground. And just like the Ice Age hunters who built low-to-the-ground fire pits, you should dig a shallow trench for your stove or candle, letting the heat radiate upward while the cold air stays below. Second, fire maintenance. Cave sites reveal burnt, fire hollows, lined with stones and covered with a layer of ash, which acted like a primitive thermal battery, preserving embers for days. Today, a small metal container of dry tinder, think cotton balls soaked in petroleum jelly, can be stored in a waterproof bag and used to rekindle a fire even after hours of exposure. Keep a few pre-made fire sticks in your kit. They are the modern equivalent of the flint nap spark sticks our ancestors fashioned from quartz and pyrite. Third, nutrition on the go. Ice Age people did not wait for a fresh kill. They dried meat on rocks and stored it in cold caves, creating a natural jerky that lasted months. In a winter emergency, pack dehydrated meat or fish or a few strips of pre-cooked jerky. Pair them with high-energy nuts and dried berries, foods that provide both protein and quick sugars needed to keep your metabolism humming in the cold. Fourth, wound care. Cave findings show that early humans used moss, bark, and animal fat to dress cuts, creating a barrier against infection. The principle is simple: a sterile, absorbent layer plus an antimicrobial coating. In your kit, include sterile gauze, a small tin of petroleum jelly, and a handful of clean pine needles or cotton. The pine resin, like ancient sap, has natural antiseptic properties that can buy you time until professional care arrives. Finally, community and knowledge sharing. Excavated burial sites suggest that elders were revered not just for wisdom, but for their ability to recall seasonal patterns, safe routes, and shelter locations. In a modern emergency, designate a knowledge keeper, someone who knows how to read a compass, judge snow stability, or improvise a snow shelter. Share the ancient habit of gathering around a fire to exchange stories. The morale boost is as crucial now as it was when a single hearth kept a whole band of hunters from freezing. So the next time a winter storm cuts you off, remember, layer up like a mammoth skin mattress. Keep embers alive with a stone-lined fire pit. Eat like a Paleolithic hunter with dried protein, dress wounds with natural antiseptics, and lean on collective know-how. The Ice Age lacked insulated jackets and portable heaters, but the principles they mastered still work, if you are willing to borrow a bit of ancient ingenuity.